You have got to watch this before it's too late, as governments and international organizations try to convince us of the importance of adopting severe policies in order to mitigate the supposed effects of climate change. An increased number of notable scientists and people with deep knowledge on this subject matter are coming forward and criticizing the extreme approach of these left-wing policies. One of them is Bjørn Lomborg, who, along with Jordan Peterson, continue to dismantle the myths propagated by the environmentalists. Before I delve into this, watch it.
You know, our Prime Minister in Canada has just decided to do the same thing to Canadian farmers that the Netherlands has done to the Dutch farmers. He's going to force them, because he likes to use force, because he's saving the planet, even though he's not. He's going to force them to reduce their nitrous oxide output. And here, get this, man, this is something. He decided that he's going to do that without calculating the ratio of pollution produced to food produced. And so the provinces and the farmers are pushing back and saying, well, how about you judge our polluting use on the basis of how much food we produce? Wouldn't that be like vaguely reasonable? And the answer from the feds has been, no, we want an absolute reduction. And that's exactly an example of this low resolution, narcissistic moralism that is substituting both for genuine religious conviction and for genuine knowledge. And I would say our Prime Minister in Canada, if it isn't Jacinda Ardern and Kamala Harris, it's definitely Justin Trudeau, who are the poster people for this sort of thinking.
So just very briefly, it's a great example of how economists would approach this conversation. It's basically saying, look, there is something nice about this idea of reducing nitrogen deposits. It actually, especially biologists, but also other people like the fact that there are low fertilizer areas, where different kinds of sparse plantations live, and that can be a nice sort of ecosystem. But if you ask most people, how much are you willing to pay for that? So, the other set is we can't produce as much food. We can't keep our culture. A lot of farmers are going to go bankrupt. And of course, also that you're just going to move this nitrogen deposit to, for instance, developing countries instead.
Right, exactly.
Then you have to ask, so what's the weighing of these two things? We do that all the time. And let me just give you this one obvious consequence.
That's called thinking.
When you talk about the speed limit, most people, if you don't, so in the US, about 40,000 people die on the roads every year, mostly because people drive too fast. And the simple question is, well, shouldn't you do something about it? If you don't reflect very much, people will just say, yeah, that number should be zero. Well, there's a very obvious way to get it to zero. It is to put the speed limit at 5 kilometers or 3 miles an hour. Now, nobody would get killed, but nobody would get anywhere either. So that's, of course, why we don't actually do it. Every year and every day we decide, all of us, yes, I would like to go at a reasonable speed, and that will end up meaning some people will die. There's a trade-off here. Now, we can have a sensible conversation. Do we want to have, sorry, I'm a little unsure of whether I should use miles or kilometer. I'm just going to go with miles, right?
It's okay.
Should we use 55 kilometers? I didn't do that, did I? 55 miles or 85 miles. And that's a fine conversation, but nobody suggests it should be 0 or 3 miles an hour. And that's the conversation that we need to have in all these other things. So when we're talking about nitrogen deposit, of course, we all want to have less rather than more, but we also have lots of other things we want to do. We need to recognize those
like
trade-offs.
eat.
The pursuit of extreme climate change policies has become a defining feature of the radical left's political agenda in our modern society. While the goals of mitigating climate change and transitioning to renewable energy sources are noble, the means by which the world governments and international organizations seek to achieve these objectives raises a serious concern and are downright questionable. Recently, nitrous oxide has joined the emission non grata list of elements as we continue to wage a war on the periodic table. The Canadian government is aiming to slash nitrous oxide emissions by 30% by the year 2030. The Dutch government is trying to achieve a similar result as well. Environmentalists have deemed it to be dangerous for the climate and argue that it hampers the efforts in fighting global warming. It's vital to note that Dutch and Canadian farmers already use fertilizer far more efficiently than other countries in the world. The head of Fertilizer Canada, Karen Proud, commented on this issue, noting, and I quote, "There's not much room for farmers to go before they start losing productivity and before their yields are affected, because of course you need fertilizer to maximize your yields." That's right, the implementation of harsh environmental policies are coming at a significant cost, both economically and socially. Governments are increasingly overlooking the immediate needs of our societies, particularly the well-being of industries reliant on producing some level of greenhouse gas emissions. Other than the farmers, those policies are having negative effects for workers on the coal, oil, and gas sectors, leading to massive job losses, and most of them aren't replaceable ones. A study recently shows that in 2019, the oil and gas sector in the United States employed over 1 million workers, with over 60% of them not having the required skills to transition into an energy renewable sector dominated by renewables. That is to say that over 650,000 people will not have their jobs exist due to the current left-dominating government's radical stance on climate change.
So I want to return to something you said, and then I want to talk about economists versus biologists, let's say. So when I had calculated, and this is a rough calculation, and I knew it was wrong, I figured that we'd be facing a world in the fall and the winter where 150 million people would be starving. But Michael Bjørn mentioned that it was going to be 1.2 billion. That was his estimate. And I thought, oh my God, not only is that famine on a level that we haven't seen probably since the early 60s, and then he talked about how famine multiplies, because once a famine hits, the governments tend to take centralized control over food production and basically appropriate farmers' crops, and then the farmers quit growing crops, which is exactly what you'd expect. So not only do you have 1 billion, you have the stage set for an expansion of famine. And then I thought, well, and Bjørn commented on this as well, well, what happens when 1.2 billion people go hungry? And that's going to be, well, in the poorest countries throughout the countries that are most likely as well to push desperate immigrants towards Europe's borders, and the same on the American front. And so not in the fall, you tell me again if I'm wrong, if you are right and Bjørn is right, not only are we going to see a seventh of the world go hungry in a serious way, like it's already happening in Sri Lanka, but we're going to see immigration pressure, movement pressure on the flanks of Europe and the United States on a scale that maybe we've never seen. And how sure are you that that's what we're looking at in the fall and winter?
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, we're starting out in a world where there's already some 700 or 800 million people that are starving. And this has fairly little to do with the current energy crisis or fertilizer crisis, but it's just the fact of people being poor. So again, that goes to your general point of saying, look, maybe we should get people out of poverty first. But the second part of this is, it actually turns out that when people are really, really poor and really damaged in many ways, for instance, through starvation, they will not flee because they can't. So I'm not sure that we're going to see huge immigration streams. We might, and I think it's useful to start thinking about, but I don't have the data on whether. So there's it's actually, you see more refugee streams when people get richer, because then they can start afford to get on trucks or buses or even flights and go to Europe and the US. But if you're really poor, you're just stuck. This is more of a moral problem than I think it's going to be at first a political problem. But I think fundamentally this is about our priorities, and it's about saying, what kind of moral person do you want? Do you want to be the moral person that said, I want to save the world from climate change, so I'm going to make sure we don't use gas to make fertilizer that could save millions of people? Or are you actually going to be a person who says, no, I actually think saving people's lives is a little more important?
That's an interesting question that we should encourage the left to think about more often. Taking an extreme approach or addressing climate change, or any issue for that matter, will have several negative consequences and may not be the most effective or sustainable solution. Extreme approaches often involve rigid one-size-fits-all solutions that may not account for the diverse needs, circumstances, and perspectives on different communities. This lack of flexibility leads to unintended consequences, which has dramatic effects on people's lives. For example, if we take a closer look at the Sri Lanka case Dr. Peterson mentioned, we'll find that it was a failed experiment. The former president wanted to transition the country into organic agriculture. That's why synthetic fertilizer and pesticides were banned. The ban led to an implosion in the agricultural sector and to a 20 to 70% drop in crop yields, depending on the crop, with small farmers being the most affected. It's important to note that more than 80% of Sri Lanka's population is rural. This naturally led to massive protests and the president having to flee the country in July 2022. Additionally, implementing extreme measures to address climate change requires transition to technologies or infrastructure that are not yet feasible or widely available. For example, transitioning to 100% renewable energy sources is highly challenging due to limitations in energy storage technology and grid infrastructure. The European Union, for instance, only got 22% of its energy from wind and solar in 2022, with extreme drought leading to a 15% drop in hydropower generation. I think that's more than enough to show that renewables aren't reliable in producing our energy needs, and the path we're currently on will only lead to a grim future.
Isn't it even almost worse, right? Because I think in many instances, particularly in Africa, right? I mean, it was European policies, particular, who hampered and in some cases really sabotaged their ability to feed themselves, right? By not allowing them access to energy. I mean, if you look at, for example, global maps about electricity supplies, there is a huge gap in most of Africa, which also has the highest number of birth rates. So the population that's growing fastest is the one with the most limited access to energy. And as you know, right, whether it's high temperatures or low temperatures or whether food production, energy is key. And I think in many ways, it was kind of deliberate policies, kind of the idea that you can all of a sudden run, I don't know, the Democratic Republic of Congo or these areas that you can run them on wind and solar. So it seems that it's not just that we don't help them to get rich. If somebody would be a cynic, but I think it's true. In some cases, we kept them poor, particularly when it came to energy and food production.
Now, the African case is the most interesting one. In this part of the world, the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom were pushing for energy policies that took into consideration climate change and the need to reduce carbon emissions at the United Nations Biodiversity Conference in 2009. Quote, developed countries pledged an annual $100 billion in climate finance to developing countries for both adaptation and mitigation, but pledges have never really materialized. The aid agency Oxfam estimates that only about a third of the money has been delivered. But that changed overnight after the Russian war on Ukraine, mainly because the EU was heavily reliant on Russian gas imports to meet its energy needs. EU members started encouraging African countries to start exporting gas to them, but African countries are still being told to limit their use of such dirty energy. In other words, the EU is saying, rules for thee, but not for me. European intervention in African energy affairs has frequently focused on extracting natural resources such as oil, gas, and minerals. What's even more interesting is that more than 600 million of Africa's 1.3 billion people live without electricity. African leaders have continually called to tap into their gas reserves in order to generate revenues, but have been continuously denied, mostly because of the European companies like BP and Total Energies controlling the fossil fuel extraction. Nigeria, for example, holds 3% of the world's gas reserves, but it doesn't get extracted for Nigeria to put it to good use, as 40% of the extracted gas gets shipped to Europe. This only leads to resource exploitation and depletion instead of improving the lives of people in poverty and hunger infested in that region of the world.